Hi, this is Heidi Burgess. Today I want to finish up a series of 3 videos on what Guy and I think about when we think about reconciliation. In the first video, I showed this bell curve, which is typically shown when theorists are talking about the stages that conflict typically goes through. But I observed that when you're talking about highly escalated, intractable conflicts, this diagram actually makes more sense. That's because the conflict doesn't simply go up, reach a hurting stalemate, and then go down to reconciliation. Rather, it tends to get caught in a vicious cycle, going round and round. It's very hard to escape that cycle into peace or reconciliation, but I likened how one escapes the cycle to the process of a rocket escaping the Earth. A rocket has to reach a particular speed and height in order to escape the atmosphere. And you can also think of a similar process needing to happen to escape the intractability cycle. I continued that rocket metaphor in the first video, suggesting that a rocket has stages. So too does reconciliation. But then I went on to explain that the rocket metaphor had a problem, actually, because conflicts aren't predictable determinate systems, as rockets are, but rather they're complex adaptive systems. That means they're indeterminate and not predictable, although they do tend to follow patterns that can be observed. So then I came up with another metaphor, which is baking. Even this isn't really a complex process. You follow a recipe for chocolate chip cookies and they come out wonderful every time. But the reason I like this metaphor better is that you can alter the ingredients, you can change the amounts, you can put them together in different ways and they'll come out differently. So you can get cookies or muffins or bread or pancakes. They can be soft or crunchy. They could have walnuts. There's lots of options. So there's 2 ways to apply the baking metaphor to reconciliation. One is to define the steps that I had in the rocket metaphor as ingredients. So setting the stage with peacemaking and peacekeeping is one ingredient, prospective reconciliation is another ingredient, retrospective reconciliation is a third ingredient. The fourth ingredient is implementing the vision at the interpersonal intergroup level with attitudinal and transactional changes, while the fifth ingredient is implementing the vision at the societal level with structural and transactional changes. Unlike stages that necessarily come in a particular order, if you use the recipe metaphor, you might start reconciliation before peacemaking and peacekeeping occurs, or it might be after or simultaneously. You might have prospective reconciliation come first and then retrospective, or you might do them at the same time. The same is true with implementation. You might do small-scale implementation first, large-scale second, or you might do the reverse, or you might do them simultaneously. The key idea is that you have flexibility, and there isn't one right answer for every situation. The other way to apply the baking metaphor is to consider Lederach's meeting place. Here you get the notion that the ingredients are peace, justice, truth, and mercy, and the outcome is a reconciliation cookie. But unlike a real cookie recipe in which the relative quantities of each ingredient are about the same, given that conflicts are complex, you need to alter both the ingredients themselves and the amount you'll use depending on the situation. So sometimes you want lots of truth and mercy, but you decide to skip retributive justice entirely. Alternatively, you might go for a lot of retributive justice and pretty much skip mercy. You will also likely need to order in which you add the ingredients. Sometimes you'll need to explore truth first, then justice, then mercy, then peace. Sometimes the need for peace will take precedent. If things are very violent, you might want to attain what is called negative peace, just stopping the shooting. And then you can begin to add in the other ingredients. Guy has long argued that reconciliation needs a fifth ingredient, hope. Although there wasn't any metaphorical meaning to the attachment I gave to the other ingredients and the concepts, I did intentionally assign hope to baking powder, because baking powder makes cookies rise. Guy would agree, I'm sure, that hope allows reconciliation to rise. Without a hope for a livable, even a desirable future, people are very unlikely to be willing to explore or pursue reconciliation. That's why I put prospective reconciliation before retrospective reconciliation in the rocket metaphor. Prospective reconciliation is the process of developing an image of the future that everyone can live with, or even look forward to. That gives hope, and it makes the rest of the reconciliation stages possible. In the last video, I talked about Ibrahim Rasool, who was a former ambassador to the United States from South Africa. He gave a talk at the Alliance for Peacebuilding's PeaceCon meeting last December, in which he said, "The process of struggle needs to incorporate the solution. You cannot call for the end of racism and mobilize on the basis of race. You cannot want a peaceful society and be wantonly violent in your conduct towards it. You cannot speak of unity and polarized society in the conduct of your struggle." He went on to suggest 7 steps, and yes, he did refer to them as steps, that allowed South Africa to reconcile after apartheid. I should note that he pointed out that this reconciliation in South Africa is far from complete. It's an ongoing process. But it's far better for everyone, he asserted, than what they might have had they not had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and started down the reconciliation road. The first step, he said, was recognizing that the other is here to stay. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The second step was to start with the end. The ANC's vision was that South Africa belongs to everyone who lives there, black and white. That not only was a statement of vision, it was an extension of friendship. It was an act of generosity. Even as whites continued to disempower and even kill blacks in South Africa, the blacks had, in his words, the supreme humanity that South Africa even belonged to the white oppressors as well as the blacks. That disrupted the little pictures that the whites had constructed in their minds of the animalistic blacks, and allowed them to open themselves up to new ideas. Now, let's go back to Rasool's step, or I might say ingredient, recognizing the other is here to stay. Very often, people in deep-rooted intractable conflicts use what Guy and I call into-the-sea framing. Guy invented that term based on former Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat's vow to push Israel into the sea. That kind of framing, in other words, thinking, is being used anytime someone thinks about a desired conflict outcome as one in which their opponent or enemy somehow simply disappears. How this disappearance might occur is sometimes evident, but often it's not. In family conflicts, the answer is often a divorce. In a business setting, someone might get fired, they might quit, or the business might break up. In the community or nation state, such splits become much more difficult. The whites were not going home in South Africa. By the time apartheid ended, most of them did not have another home. Most of the dreamers in the United States, children of illegal immigrants who were brought in by their parents, don't have another home to return to. Palestinians and Israeli Jews do not have another home. Republicans and Democrats don't have another home either. Each group, defined as the other by the other, are there to stay. After realizing that the other is here to stay, people in conflict have to decide how they want to live together. They can continue to fight the good fight. But intractable conflicts are ones in which the good fight can't be won, even if it's framed as one side is defeating the other. These conflicts usually have reached what Bill Zartman called a hurting stalemate, which we showed at the top of the bell curve earlier. They're stuck, unable to prevail, at least not for long, before the other side comes roaring back. Zartman described hurting stalemates as actually being a moment of ripeness, when people are more likely to be willing to consider reconciliation. Actually, he said settlement or resolution, not making Burton's distinction between those two, than they were when one side was overtly winning. If one side was overtly winning, they'd continue the conflict. But if they were stuck, if they saw no way to win, that was a right moment for reconciliation. But those moments of ripeness are often missed. People continue to escalate the fight, and it continues on, destroying more and more lives for months or years. This is essentially saying that they miss that blue escape arrow, and they fall back into the vicious cycle. This raises the question of what we can do to make that arrow bigger. What can we do to make it easier to catch? Well, it seems to me that we need to give people a sense that reconciliation would offer a better future than they have in the present. That's why we need to give them a sense of hope. We can also make changes in their environment. For instance, we can make continuing the conflict more difficult or more costly by restricting their access to weapons or financial or human support, and increasing one's own such access. But that latter option just fuels an arms race, so limiting the other side's capabilities is preferable, as is giving them hope. In addition to changing the rational calculations about the ability to win, we need to factor in emotional responses. We all know that conflict behavior isn't rational. It's very emotional. It's driven largely by fear. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of the future. People who are afraid often do not think or act rationally. Avoiding what one is afraid of or vanquishing what one is afraid of is a very human response. The fight or flight instinct is deeply ingrained in the human psyche. And neither approach solves conflict. What does? Replacing fear with hope. One way to do this is through peace overtures or gestures. This is a picture of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin meeting at the White House with Jimmy Carter at the end of the Camp David Accords. This meeting was made possible by a conciliatory gesture made by Anwar Sadat a couple of years earlier when he went to Jerusalem and visited with the Israeli government and the people, saying that he wanted to make peace. No Egyptian leader had done anything like that before, and the Israelis were very positively impressed. Their attitude towards Sadat personally changed, and their attitude towards Egyptians more generally changed from one of enemy to one of human. That led to the possibility of the Camp David Accords. Joe Biden's victory speech, when he said that he was going to be a president not for red America or for blue America, but for all America, was trying to be a conciliatory gesture too. So far it hasn't been reciprocated, but it may be in the coming months, particularly if Democratic policies continue to make room for former Trump supporters, instead of squashing their values and disrespecting them all, and creating a world that is hostile to people with their beliefs. I do not mean to imply here that one needs to accept racism, misogyny, and homophobia as okay. But one does need, I believe, to bring people who espouse those things around through love, not through hate, by proving, as Sadat did, that the other, meaning progressives, are actually humans, and indeed likable, equally valuable humans. And so too are Republicans. I know in the United States in the current situation, such a suggestion is for many very hard to imagine. It may not be the proper choice, but it is important to think about. What's going to happen if everyone who worked for or even voted for Trump is held accountable for Trump's crimes? Progressives are essentially doing that when they write off all Trump supporters as racists who need to be educated about the racist history of the United States. Is that going to de-escalate our conflict? Is it going to allow for reconciliation? Is it even going to lead to meaningful change in Republican worldviews? Or is it going to lead to further pushback against the progressive agenda? Similarly, what if all whites are held accountable for the harms done to blacks over the centuries? Good philosophical arguments can be made as to why that should be. But if that policy is pursued, will that help to de-escalate our current very volatile conflict? Will it allow for reconciliation? If your answer is no, then you have to decide which is more important to you, holding all whites accountable or de-escalation. If your answer is yes, then we need to figure out how to pursue that goal while still allowing reconciliation to take place. Clearly, it seems to me, this is a delicate balancing act. A related aspect of prospective reconciliation is distributive and procedural justice. Distributive justice is the fair distribution of goods, bads, and services. Bads in this context are harms, undesirable land uses such as dumps and noisy or polluting industrial facilities, for example, that more often than not are located in minority areas. In addition to deciding how to compensate for harms done in the past, which is retrospective reconciliation, prospective reconciliation needs to decide how benefits should be distributed in the present and future. Who gets to access jobs, who gets access to higher education, to good housing, etc., and how such decisions are made. The how such decisions are made part spills over into procedural justice, and the notion that decision-making procedures, both of the government and private entities, needs to be fair. People need to know the basis on which decisions are made. The decision-making criteria need to be fair. The processes need to be transparent, and guidelines need to be followed. In addition to prospective reconciliation, however, we also need retrospective reconciliation. That includes learning the truth of what happens, looking with open eyes at the action of all sides, not just one, and deciding on how wrongs committed in the past might be remedied. Here again there are decisions to be made about the type and amount of ingredients. How deeply should one dig for the truth? Should the actions of leaders be examined carefully, but followers less so or not at all? Should everyone's attitudes and behaviors be examined? If you answer the latter, how does this jive with our notion of free speech and freedom of religion? Should violent crimes be prosecuted with retributive justice mechanisms, such as war crimes tribunals or regular trials? Or should more restorative processes be used, in which offenders and victims meet and talk about the reason for the offense, the harms done, how the relationship between the people could be healed? Examples are victim-offender reconciliation used in this country, Rwanda's Gacaca courts, Native American healing circles. Typically, restorative justice is only used when the offender is willing to admit guilt and apologize. So what can and should be done when the person labeled as offender does not admit guilt and will not apologize? I raise this now as something to think about. We'll talk about it more later. Going back to the steps as ingredients, the fourth ingredient is the small-scale implementation of the vision, which usually involves changing attitudes and relationships and interpersonal and intergroup transactions. In other words, altering the way people see each other and interact together. This is the bread and butter of the peace-building field, and it's typically done through dialogue and problem-solving workshops and similar face-to-face processes that get people together, generally around a table, or sometimes outside under a tree. But it's small scale where the people actually talk to and listen to each other and make amends with each other directly. While it is very effective when measured at the level of individual participants over a short period of time, there is less indication that it is easily scaled up to societal change, or that changes last over time. Participants tend to revert to their earlier attitudes and behaviors once they return to their regular environments and routinely act with people whose attitudes and behavior are still fearful and distrustful or even aggressive towards the other. We'll consider how to maximize the effectiveness of such small-scale processes later on. Large-scale implementation involves changing social structures and transactions, and changing both how the society and the government treats individuals and how individuals treat and view the government and society. The picture on the left was taken earlier when riots broke out in Portland following the death of George Floyd. Portland became particularly violent. The Portland police, as well as federal officers and militias, all came in and were very abusive towards the protesters. So there was a very negative relationship and a lot of distrust between the citizens and the government, both at the local and the federal levels. And that remains in need of reconciliation today. The government, especially the federal government, didn't trust or support the citizens' right to protest peacefully, and the citizens were expressing their outrage at the government, particularly at the police and the wider criminal justice system. The picture on the right is a picture of a Republican lobbyist named Grover Norquist, who was famous for saying, "I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub." Well, this characteristic of wanting very small government has been characteristic of Republicans for a long time. It became a central driver of Republican behavior since 1985, when Norquist formed his group, the American for Tax Reform, which advocated cutting government programs as much as possible in order to lower taxes. In many cases, the result of tax cuts was inferior government services, which led to distrust and dislike of the government because it didn't provide what it was supposed to, which added support to those who advocated cutting government funding even more in a positive feedback system. And I couldn't help but put in this slide that points out that one of the ways in which people not trusting the government and government not trusting the people is exhibited is the whole dispute over whether or not face masks should be required to be worn in public. Face masks, of course, are generally thought to help other people as much or even more than they help the wearer. Although there are a lot of contradictory studies, it is very clear that wearing a face mask does help prevent the spread of COVID to other people. But there are lots of people in the United States who don't believe experts and don't trust the government. So they maintain that they shouldn't be ordered to wear face masks, and that such orders are a violation of their freedom of speech, since wearing or not wearing a mask became a political statement. This kind of distrust of the government and disregard of the well-being of fellow citizens is the sort of thing that has to change if we're going to have a reconciled society. In fact, if we're going to have a functioning society at all. A last note is that I started making this video shortly after the end of the Alliance for Peace Building's December 2020 meeting. The very last session was a session of police, sheriffs, and police overseers, and citizens talking about what can be done about police violence against civilians. One of the participants on the panel was Sheriff Leon Lott, who was a longtime sheriff of Richland County in South Carolina. He said that police need to work in collaboration with their communities to attain the best outcomes for all. He described their Sheriff's Advisory Board, which advises on policy and hiring and all the decisions they make. It has a high proportion of citizen members, more citizen members than law enforcement members, he said. He also said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the primary job of law enforcement is not law enforcement. It's relationship building. So that's an example of what needs to be done to change structures so that the government and the citizenry have a new reconciled relationship. It's what's referred to in Simon Key's article on mapping reconciliation, which I referenced in the earlier video, as vertical reconciliation, whereas reconciliation between the left and the right is horizontal reconciliation. So finally, in order to break out of the circle of conflict, you need to implement all 5 stages or ingredients of reconciliation, which, if you are successful, will allow you to follow the blue arrow out to the right to the place I call reconciliation, or what Rob Rosigliano calls peace writ large. Thanks.